Great. So, Adriana, would you like me to start?
Yes, please go ahead. I'm already recording.
Okay, great. So hello, everyone. Thank you for being with us here today and for joining us. My name is Kieran Mooney. I work at the Secretariat of the Convention on Biological Diversity, where I work on issues related to indicators and monitoring, and I'm helping with the negotiations and the discussions all around the Post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework. So the webinar today is focusing on issues related to monitoring ecosystem extent and integrity. So as most of you probably know, the Convention on Biological Diversity is currently in the process of developing a new framework for biodiversity. And this framework has a number of different elements, including goals and targets. And issues related to ecosystem extent and integrity feature quite prominently in one of the goals and also in a number of the targets. Now, while the goals and targets are where a lot of the attention has been so far in terms of the negotiation process, there's also been a lot of focus on monitoring and actually how are we actually going to monitor these goals and targets, and how are we going to make sure that once these goals and targets are in place, that we have the tools available to really gauge if we're going in the right direction or not, and how do we increase our efforts where needed, and things of that nature. So because of that, the Secretariat with a number of partners, including GEO Bond, but also UNEP, WCMC, the UN Regional Commissions, the UN Statistics Division, have all been organizing a series of webinars to explore different issues related to monitoring. And to see how some of these, we can share ideas on what a monitoring framework and an effective monitoring framework could look like in the post-2020 period. So as I mentioned today, the focus of today's webinar is on looking at issues surrounding monitoring ecosystem extent and integrity, and what some of the tools or techniques or approaches exist that could allow us to do that. And we're really fortunate today to have a number of sort of what I'd say leading experts in this field to share ideas and perspectives on this issue. So the way the session today is going to work is we'll have a number of sort of short presentations by the panelists, and then we'll have some time at the end for some questions and some answers. Unfortunately, the time for question and answers is probably going to be quite short. However, I would encourage all of you to reach out to any of the partners or panelists involved if you have really more detailed technical questions that you'd like to explore further. Similarly, today's session is being recorded, and it's going to be made available online shortly after the session. So if you miss anything, you can go back and get all caught up. Similarly, all the presentations are going to be made available as well. So there's going to be lots of opportunity to sort of refresh your memory, and don't worry if you happen to miss something. There's lots of ways of going back and refreshing what you've heard. If you want to ask a question, please enter it in the chat window, and that's how we'll be addressing the questions. So with that, I just wanted to again thank all of you for being here with us today. I'm really looking forward to this discussion, and I'd of course like to thank all the panelists in advance for sharing their time and their expertise. And so I think with that, we'll just jump right in, and I'll hand it off to our first speaker for today. So the first person who's going to be speaking is Gary Geller from NASA and the Jet Propulsion Laboratory, where he works as with NASA's ecological forecasting program. Gary's been a part of Geo Bond since about 2008 and has served in various capacities in Geo Bond, including on its steering and management committee, and is one of the co-leads for the ecosystem structure working group. So Gary's going to start off by providing an overview on different issues related to ecosystem extent and related indicators. Thanks. So over to you, Gary. Thank you.
Great. Thanks so much, Kieran. So yeah, I will give a brief overview of ecosystem extent, but before we do that, I will give you a very short overview of Geo Bond, the Geo Biodiversity Observation Network. Many of you are, I'm sure, familiar with that, so it may be just a refresher, but it would be a good way to start. And in particular, it's good, I think, to start with the mission statement, which is shown here. It's really to improve the acquisition, coordination, and delivery of biodiversity observations and related services to users, including decision makers in the scientific community. And some key words there are acquisition, coordination, and delivery. Those really capture the flow of information from being acquired to the users themselves. In the framework of the Global Biodiversity Framework, basically what this means is that Geo Bond supports parties to help them track and guide progress towards the national targets that they've committed to. Here's a very high-level overview of Geo Bond. It has really two focus areas, the biodiversity observation networks, and these are geared towards acquiring in situ data in particular, but not exclusively, and coordinating the acquisition of these data and turning it into products. The other one is essential biodiversity variables, which I'll give a brief overview on the next slide. And for this area, we have a series of different working groups, one focused on each variable. So the overall flow here then is from what we call primary observations through the bonds and many other sources of information, generating essential biodiversity variables, which are then the feedstock for indicators and a variety of other information to support the users. So EBVs are simply the set of measurements that capture the major dimensions of biodiversity and how it's changing. When we develop these, we first develop the criteria. Maybe the two most important ones here are that they have to be biological, which means that they're not really intended to capture everything that needs to be measured if we want to understand how and what and why biodiversity is changing. And they are intended to reflect the state of ecosystems and the biodiversity that those ecosystems contain. So with those in mind, we came up with 6 different classes, one at the genetic level, 2 at the species level, and 3 at the community and ecosystem level. And the one that we're going to focus on today is ecosystem extent, which is in the ecosystem structure class of EBVs. So let's talk about that. Let's talk about ecosystem extent. First of all, what is ecosystem extent? And it's really just a data set that outlines one or more ecosystems of interest. And to develop a data set like that, you have to define different classes to distinguish what the different ecosystems are. And this definition can be at various levels of ecosystem resolution. This is a very coarse map in northern Alaska. Each of those ecosystems can be subdivided into finer classes of ecosystems, like this one here. So classification schemes are very hierarchical, and you can select the level of detail and hierarchy that is most appropriate for the problem that you're trying to solve. But there are different ways to classify ecosystems. One, and a very common one, that's used by FAO is to use physical structure like tree height, whether it's trees or grasslands and so forth. And this is the core of their land cover classification system, which has been very widely used, or different variants of that. A different approach, which is more focused on potential ecosystems rather than where they actually exist, is to use the physical environment, the climate, soil, slope, elevation, and so forth. And that's what USGS has done with something they call global ecosystem land units. But a third way combines a variety of these other focus areas to look at both the structure, the composition, as well as the function and processes of ecosystems. And this is the approach used by what's called the IUCN Ecosystem Typology version 2.0. And what's interesting and really different about this is that it's focused on function and processes, and that's very important for ecosystem services. And that's why the UN Statistical Mission has selected as the standard for ecosystems for the UN, their UNCEA work. But ecosystem extent is really just the feedstock for a variety of other products. Once you have more or less a pixel-based classification, you can, for example, add up the size of all these pixels in a particular ecosystem to get the total area of that ecosystem. So that's ecosystem extent. But also, if you know which pixels are in which class, you can assess fragmentation, an important component of condition. You can look for corridors, like in this picture here. You can look to see if ecosystems are moving maybe upslope to higher elevations where it's cooler, or towards the poles where it's cooler because the climate is changing. And there are a variety of other applications as well in terms of looking at habitat. And as I mentioned, environmental accounting, where the Statistical Commission comes in. There's a close relationship of ecosystem maps to land cover. Land cover includes non-ecosystem classes like urban areas and agriculture. So they're not quite the same thing, but they are very often really the only maps or classification schemes that are actually available to people who need an ecosystem map. But land cover maps, as well as their generation, have a number of challenges. First of all, the number of classes that they provide, or the types of classes that are provided, may not actually be the ones that you need, but that's what you're stuck with if that's the only map that's available. Many of them are very labor intensive, so they're not updated frequently. The spatial resolution may be too coarse, and the accuracy may vary, often in ways that are not articulated for the area or the country that you're particularly interested in. So they're more available than anything else, but they're not perfect, but they're still very useful. Well, obviously land cover is focused on terrestrial ecosystems, but part of the world, as you probably know, is covered with oceans. Oceans are a fluid, so it moves around with the currents and the wind and so forth. And the ecosystems there, which we call seascapes, are very, very dynamic. But we can map those as well. And this started maybe 5 years ago, creating maps using about 30 different classes of ecosystems that we can see from space. And these are available on a weekly basis. You can go to a NOAA website, I should have listed it here, and get the week's map for really any place in the world. That's still an emerging field, but really quite an interesting one. So in the context of the Global Biodiversity Framework, let's take a look at that. Goal A, as many of you probably know, is that the integrity of all ecosystems is enhanced, with a focus on the area connectivity and integrity of ecosystems. And the major components of that are, not surprisingly really, the area, the connectivity, and the integrity of these ecosystems. In terms of the key indicators for these components, the first one in terms of area is just ecosystem extent. But there's an indicator for each of a variety of different ecosystems. These are some of the examples here. And these really are indicated really the same as the component indicators. So there's an indicator really for the extent of each ecosystem. For connectivity and integrity, the species habitat index, which was presented in an earlier, I think back in July, the species population webinar talked about that. And then there are two component indicators, one by the Convention of Migratory Species. They are in charge of the connectivity indicator, and then there's also the ecosystem integrity index. Some of the key challenges, well, most of them relate to land cover maps, which I already talked about. The geographic extent may not be what you need. They may not be updated frequently enough. The accuracy varies, and the classes may not be quite the ones that you need. So there are some limitations, but that really remains currently the most common source for the information we need. A lot of these are available on the Geo Bond EBV data portal. The portal is shown here. And I believe that is my last slide. So thank you for listening. Kieran, back to you.
Great, thank you so much, Gary. That's a really useful overview, I think, to sort of get a sense of what we're all talking about and aiming towards, and what resources are currently out there. So we're going to keep on going in the interest of time. So the next panelist today is Víctor Hugo Gutierrez Velez from Temple University, where he's an assistant professor in the Department of Geography. And he uses specifically remote sensing and spatial modeling to identify drivers of ecological change and the implications of these changes for biodiversity conservation, but also people's well-being. So today he's going to be speaking about improving capacity for monitoring ecosystem extent and integrity through the integration of global and national data products. So over to you, Víctor. Thanks.
Thank you, Kieran. Let me share my screen. I am going to talk today about the work we are doing in Colombia on harnessing the potential of Earth observations for biodiversity monitoring and decision making. Someone has the microphone open? Can you please? Thank you. This is funded by NASA, and it's implemented in collaboration with the von Humboldt Institute. In recent years, we have witnessed an explosion of a wide array of global data products at an unprecedented spatial and temporal resolution that have the potential to revolutionize our ability to monitor ecosystem change. And at the same time, different bonds, and in this case, the country of Colombia, have developed also a wide array of products that are adapted or are developed for the specific conditions of the country and are tailored for the specific needs for decision making. So part of the motivation of this work is how can we bring together these two data streams to ensure that this data can inform biodiversity decision making and monitoring efforts, and at the same time keep consistent with global efforts for ecosystem mapping and take advantage of the virtues of these global products. So right now we are working on three priorities. The first one is to produce methods for data integration. The other one is to produce software that facilitates data integration analysis. And the third one is to enable access to data and methods so that we can inform biodiversity reporting and decision making. So in terms of data integration, I'm going to illustrate what we are doing with the work that we have performed on integrating the national forest cover maps with the global maps on forest change developed by Matt Hansen et al. Both data products are developed from starting in 2000, but you can see that the national map in Colombia has some gaps, particularly in the first decade. Now, if we zoom in into a specific area, we see in the upper left map that there are some important data gaps in some years in the national map, and that's mostly due to problems with, for example, Landsat 7 or gaps produced by clouds or cloud shadows. On the other hand, the map by Matt Hansen is wall-to-wall, has information in all pixels, but if you can see here, the forest definition that they use includes tree plantations or any kind of tree cover that has canopy. So the idea is how we can bring those two data streams so that we can take the strengths of each one of the data sets and come up with a more robust product. You can see that these data products differ quite substantially, and that's due in part to the fact that Matt Hansen has another data set that allows users to define what is the threshold they can use to define what is forest and what is not. So what we are doing is to produce a common maximum forest extent for the two products. Then we are using the National Biotic Units map that defines ecosystem types based on some specific attributes. And then finding for each one of the more than 200 biotic units in the country, the optimal tree cover threshold that maximizes the agreement between these two maps. And then we are aggregating those optimal maps at the national level. And you can see here that for the most part, we achieved an agreement of above 90%. And we can see that the optimal threshold varies greatly among different biotic units. And we have found an overall agreement between the two maps of 95%. We are also working with some data sets. This is an example with the National Wetlands Map, which is a benchmark map for one specific moment in time. And we are finding the agreement of these maps with two globally produced maps on water surface change, so that we can add a temporal dimension to these maps. We are working with some other data sets. This is a work in progress, and we are coming up with a workflow. The idea is to combine all these maps on ecosystems and land covers and come up with a legend that best represents the strengths of these maps. We are developing some decision rules to resolve classification conflicts in any given pixels. And we are starting to do some work in some windows for quality assurance and control. The idea is that all this analysis will allow us to identify data gaps. And we are also developing multi-temporal spectral metrics derived from remote sensing, mostly Landsat and radar products, to fill those gaps and then hopefully go into this cycle of quality assurance and control and keep improving these products. In terms of software, we have developed two pieces of software. The first one allows users to download a wide array of global data sets for a particular area of interest and harmonize those data sets to produce time series of spatial biodiversity, essential biodiversity variables. As you can see, most of them have to do with ecosystem extent and integrity variables, and then allow users to develop workflows to develop metrics and indicators. This is a package named EcoChange, and it's already available in the ArcRAN repository for anyone to use it. The other piece of software enables the production of quantitative and unbiased indicators of change between two dates. We have demonstrated that these methods are more robust than the standard ones. The method also allows to synchronize spectral data from different dates and produce seamless mosaics that can facilitate the production of land cover maps and also extrapolate those maps in time. And we have a publication based on this work. It's open access for anyone who wants to know a little bit more about it. The third priority is to enable access to data in methods to inform reporting, biodiversity reporting and decision making. For this, we are developing an integrated cloud infrastructure that includes a front end. We have a prototype of this front end that we already have shared with some super users. And the idea is to allow decision makers and other officials to have access to data and metrics that they can use for assessing progress towards biodiversity conservation. We have a cloud backend infrastructure to store all the data. And the idea, and it also has this software part of the software that we have developed as the brain of the system. The idea is that this software will enable interactions with experts or tier 2 users and tier 1 users by making use of this software to expand the capabilities of the system or derive new products. So in summary, we are harmonizing global and national data sets, and our aim is to inform biodiversity monitoring decision-making nationally while ensuring consistency with global assessments. We are developing a cloud infrastructure that facilitates the use of harmonized data to characterize, monitor, and reporting biodiversity conservation efforts. And we are also integrating data, software, and infrastructure to enable dynamic data improvements and timely data use for decision making. Thank my collaborators and obviously NASA for their support. And thank you for coming to this webinar.
Great. Thank you very much, Victor. It's really interesting to see how, the approach that's being taken to sort of harmonize this global level information, and then also bring in the national perspective and sort of resolve any differences or conflicts you can say that may exist in the different data sets. So that's, I know that's something that countries have often in the convention expressed issues and challenges around. So it's really interesting to hear that. Thank you.
Thank you.
So next, the next panelist is Emily Nicholson, who is a conservation scientist from Deakin University. And she co-leads IUCN's Red List of Ecosystem Assessment thematic group in the Commission on Ecosystem Management. And her research focuses on conservation decision-making, biodiversity monitoring, and risk assessment. Now, unfortunately, Emily couldn't be with us in person, so to speak, today, but she was kind enough to send us a recording of her presentation. So I suppose, Adriana, you'll start that?
I will show it. I have
okay.
it here ready.
Okay.
Yeah.
Super. Thank you so much. Over to you.
Sure.
Victor, we are not hearing.
Nicholson from Deakin University in Melbourne, Australia. Today, I'll talk to you about why we need an ecosystem goal in the Post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework, why it's now possible and how it can be framed, measured and met. Much of my presentation will come from a recent paper we published shown here, and I'd like to acknowledge my co-authors in it. So the Post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework is a successor to the Aichi targets of the Strategic Plan for Biodiversity, which were largely not met. The Aichi targets included a clear target for species, target 12 on extinctions, but lacked a comparable target for ecosystems. Instead, there were references to specific ecosystem types like forests and coral reefs scattered across multiple targets, but there was no clear aspiration for all ecosystems. A goal for ecosystems is needed because ecosystems are fundamental to meeting all of the goals of the Post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework, shown by colour here. The vast majority of species and genetic diversity depends on safeguarding the diversity of natural ecosystems, in green, but also goals for sustainable use and maintaining nature's contributions to people, in orange, and fair and equitable sharing of the benefits of genetic diversity, in blue, also depend on sustaining ecosystem functions, processes and diversity. The last decades have seen big advances in science to allow the design and implementation of an ecosystem goal. We have widely accepted practical and workable definitions of ecosystems and their collapse that have stood up legally and in practical implementation worldwide. Many of these definitions were formalised in the Global Standard for Ecosystem Risk Assessment, the IUCN Red List of Ecosystems. So ecosystems are made up of living or biotic components, the abiotic environment, the processes and interactions within between them, and the physical space in which these operate. Ecosystem collapse is the endpoint of decline, where an ecosystem type loses its defining features, species, structure and functions, and is replaced by a different, often depauperate ecosystem type. Defining collapse for a given ecosystem is done through a combination of empirical data, ecological theory, and expert judgment. There have been huge advances in ecosystem mapping, particularly through remote sensing, which can allow trends in an increasing array of ecosystem types to be monitored from the level of ecosystem type to biome. And this includes intertidal ecosystems, mangroves, coral reefs, cloud forests, sea ice. The list seems to expand every day. We also now have agreed frameworks for classifying and grouping ecosystems. The IUCN Global Ecosystem Typology was developed through consultation, review and revision with over 100 specialists and experts led by Professor David Keith. It's been adopted and recognised by international bodies such as the UN Statistical Division for Ecosystem Accounting and the Post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework. There's an IUCN publication with a journal article in the works, and a website where you can explore the ecosystems of the world through descriptions, maps and photos. The typology includes all ecosystems, including marine, terrestrial and freshwater, in a hierarchical structure from realms to biomes and just over 100 ecosystem functional groups. These capture variation in ecosystem function and composition. The typology allows bottom-up integration of national classifications and maps, for example, in Colombia and South Africa, and has already been used to develop new ecosystem classifications, for example, in Myanmar. Through the IUCN Red List of Ecosystems and the UN System for Environmental Economic Accounting, we also have global standards for measuring ecosystem change for extent and degradation, and with the Red List of Ecosystems, risk of collapse. So this map shows the availability of ecosystem assessments using the Red List of Ecosystems standard, with pink and red showing the completed assessments and yellow those underway. And like the ecosystem maps, global coverage is increasing rapidly. So this established theory, tools and data now allow us to design a science-based goal for ecosystems. An effective ecosystem goal needs three core components to halt and reverse biodiversity loss: ecosystem area, integrity and risk of collapse. So ecosystem area or extent is fundamental to measuring global change, which is why it's included in many goals. Loss of area reduces niches, carrying capacity and the biodiversity and ecosystem functions that can be supported. Ecosystem integrity is the degree to which an ecosystem's current composition, structure and function resembles that of its reference states, which represent the variation in undisturbed states. Loss of integrity increases species extinction risk, reduces capacity to sustain species and ecosystem functions, and thus ecosystem services, and diminishes resilience to climate change and other drivers. Finally, an ecosystem goal also needs to include ecosystem collapse. Avoiding collapse is fundamental to a goal for halting biodiversity loss, just like avoiding species extinctions. Reducing collapse risk, the probability of collapse, means preventing collapse, preventing ecosystems from becoming threatened and stopping them from becoming more threatened. Including collapse risk provides a benchmark for unacceptable declines in area and integrity. These are also connected concepts shown here in this simple theory of change. Direct drivers of biodiversity loss cause declines in area and integrity, in turn increasing the risk of ecosystem collapse. Loss in area can also reduce integrity through edge effects and loss of species and processes, while as integrity declines, eventually the ecosystem transforms into something else or collapses and area is lost. So the theory of change shows us pathways for action targets as well, these blue circles, to contribute to achieving the goal. For example, actions to halt loss and to reverse it through restoration. But it can also support the selection of a set of indicators for the monitoring framework by identifying the most appropriate indicators for measuring each goal component. So we reviewed 28 indicators that have been proposed for ecosystem components of the Post-2020 framework, including some indicators from Geo Bond. We reviewed them against a range of criteria, but here I'll focus on just some key areas. So we tested the alignment of the indicators with core components of the goal, area, integrity and collapse risk. We tested ecosystem relevance. Can the indicators be linked to specific types of ecosystems? They're defining ecosystem features and therefore key thresholds like an ecosystem collapse. Has the indicator been tested so we can reliably interpret trends, including response to pressures or data biases? And we also examine the availability and accessibility of data in space and time. So apologies for this big table. This is just to show some of the findings, and I want to draw out some of our key results. So first, we only had one indicator that estimated collapse risk, which was derived from the red list of ecosystems. While indicators of area and integrity are numerous, they're biased towards terrestrial ecosystems and especially forests, and towards measuring compositional aspects of integrity rather than ecosystem function. Importantly, we found that most indicators had low ecosystem relevance. That is, they can't be related to particular ecosystem types, even at quite broad levels, the biome level in the typology, nor to ecosystem-specific change in key characteristics, or to therefore how close this change is to important thresholds like collapse. This makes them very hard to interpret other than in quite a general way, such as things are getting better or getting worse. We don't know how close they are to being disastrous. We also found some trade-offs between data coverage and ecosystem relevance, where globally available broad-scale data typically had low relevance, while ecosystem-specific data was limited. And importantly, most indicators are not well tested, which has big implications for our ability to interpret change in indicators and relate it to meaningful change to ecosystems. So to conclude, to be effective, the post-2020 framework needs a strong scientific basis. And for ecosystems, it needs to go beyond area and integrity and include the risk of ecosystem collapse. A causal theory of change can support the development of goals and effective targets and show pathways for impact, as well as the selection of indicators. Given the needs of an effective ecosystem goal that I've outlined, it's very apparent that the indicator set also needs work to make sure it can support the framework effectively and monitor progress towards the goals. In particular, we recommend an ongoing and open process to identify fit-for-purpose indicators as we move through this era of rapid change in the availability of data and the science to develop better indicators and test them. So thanks to our partners and funders in this work, and thank you for the opportunity to talk to you today. I'm sorry I can't be there in person, given the tyranny of time difference. Hello, my name is Emily Nicholson from Deakin University in Melbourne, Australia. Today, I'll talk to you about why we need an
Great. So thank you very much, Emily and Victor, for helping to run the presentation. We're going to move on. I'll just note that the SIA standards and the work that Emily mentioned, we'll hear a bit more about that later in the session from one of the other panelists. So next up, we have Andrew Hansen, who's from Montana State University, where he's a professor in the ecology department and director of the Landscape Biodiversity Lab. And his research focuses on interactions among biodiversity, climate change, and land use, with an emphasis on large landscape management and protected areas. He'll be speaking a bit more about monitoring forest ecosystem integrity within the post-2020 framework. So over to you, Andrew.
Hey, good morning, everybody. It's very good to be with you. Interesting presentations so far. We'll just get the talk up. Let's talk about this notion of ecosystem integrity conceptually and also in terms of how to monitor it. The CBC now is soliciting input on a quantifiable definition of ecosystem integrity and a means of monitoring it. And in this talk, I'll share with you what we're calling a schema for how to use Earth observations to, in fact, quantify and monitor ecosystem integrity globally, particularly in the context of forests. So let's talk about a definition of integrity. describe the schema, and then wrap up with a conclusion or two. And this talk is based on a paper that several of the folks in attendance here are co-authored, Patrick Jantz and Walter Jetz and Simon Ferrier and others, recently published in Conservation Letters. So the details are available there. Ecosystem integrity is traditionally defined as structure, function, composition relative to the natural range of variation in these characteristics. The concept has been widely applied, but only in local to regional contexts, not in a global context. And that leads to our recommended approach, the so-called schema, where satellite remote sensing provides inputs for data products, such as the canopy cover and forest extent that Gary and Victor talked about. These data products are combined into higher order indicators of ecosystem integrity. For example, carbon density or climate connectivity or biodiversity habitat. And then trends in these indicators are tracked over time relative to reference conditions as a way of evaluating change in status or trends. And then the final step is communication in a user-friendly format where policymakers can quickly grasp which indicators are improving or degrading. So this approach is in the context. So EI here is set within a context of a traditional definition of ecosystem and the broader state factors such as climate or human activities that drive ecosystems. And basically, change in ecological integrity is established by evaluating these indicators of EI during the contemporary period, but relative to some previous condition, relative to some natural reference condition. And hence that having a natural or pre-modern benchmark becomes a really important way to judge the status of the indicator today. And in this context, we're defining integrity as before, a measure of ecosystem structure, function, and composition, specifically relative to the reference state of these components being predominantly determined by the extant climate geophysical environment. So a lot of thinking about what's natural, what's pre-industrial, and in the end, we use this terminology to most reflect what that benchmark condition might be. Well, we evaluated several potential EI indicators relative to 6 criteria. Many of these are EBVs. And based on the evaluation, we ended up with this list of recommended metrics. So some such as Hedley-Grantham's lost forest configuration for ecosystem structure, and some of the MODIS products for ecosystem function. And then for composition, the species habitat index that Gary mentioned earlier by Walter, and then these additional measures of composition, including the work by Simon. So each of these recommended indicators can be evaluated relative to a reference state of different types depending upon data availability. So most feasible will be simply trends in the contemporary period, change over time in the last 20 years at one extreme, very feasible, but not fully representative of some pre-industrial reference state. Two, and the other extreme, actual reconstructions based on paleoecological data. And each country will probably have a different solution to establishing reference state. So this has just been a brief overview of the schema and the recommended metrics at this point. We're basically advocating that the CBD work towards trying to operationalize an approach like this. More work is needed to bring it to the point where it can be operationalized, but we recommend that be done so that we have a good basis for monitoring change in ecosystem integrity in the post-2020 period. So thanks very much.
Great, thank you very much, Andrew. A lot of interesting food for thought there. I think both in terms as we think about the monitoring framework, but also the goals and targets themselves of the new framework. So we'll keep chugging along. So next we have Patrick Jantz, who is a research professor in the School of Informatics, Computing, and Cyber Systems at Northern Arizona University. And his sort of two main areas of focus are assessing the impacts of climate change and land use on tropical forest carbon and biodiversity, and on identifying areas in human-dominated tropical landscapes that may most effectively promote forest connectivity and associated ecosystem services. Patrick is also a member of the Global Ecosystem Dynamic Investigation, or GEDI, science team, and he'll be speaking about forest extent and integrity, indicators for national reporting, particularly related to SDG 15. And Patrick's going to use Peru, Colombia, and Ecuador as sort of case studies to help illustrate some of these ideas. So over to you, Patrick.
Hey, thanks, Kieran, and thanks everyone for tuning in. So the previous speakers, Andy, Emily, Gary, and others did a nice job of describing the rationale for the concept of ecosystem extent and integrity for monitoring progress toward SDGs and other goals, GBF. And so I'll talk a little bit about a project that I've been involved with that, let me see if I can advance my slide here. Okay, there we go. Through a NASA-funded project, Andy Hansen is part of that team. Several other institutions are as well. But the idea is to take some of these scientific concepts, Earth observations and data products, and integrate them at the national level for policymaking and reporting on SDG 15, which of course focuses on sustainable use of terrestrial ecosystems and halting biodiversity loss. So just the goal of the project is to move from satellite imagery to reporting and actually impacts on the ground. And so this project is kind of formulated in the context of SDG 15, but there's strong crossover, as you all know, between SDGs and the post-2020 GBF. So some of the indicators I described will be relevant in the context of the GBF. But really what we found is that it's often this last part is the hardest, is getting these Earth observations integrated in decision making. And so the primary lesson we've learned from previous projects is that engagement is really critical early on in order to basically get Earth observations in the decision-making process. And we've seen some good examples of that in the previous presentations. In this project, we have monthly project calls with dozens of participants, annual workshops, and we also have attempted to engage with regional partnerships in order to navigate essentially all of these kind of organizational structures. So the reason we're doing this is to really develop a more detailed understanding of the reporting process in each country, and it's different in each country. And so this hierarchical organizational chart shows that with Peru, Colombia, and Ecuador. And so the environment ministries are shown in orange here, and they interface with environmental monitoring and assessment institutes shown in blue. But then the official reporting is frequently done by statistics offices. And so all these agencies and groups need to articulate with one another. And so that's what that engagement has been about to a large extent, is just understanding who's talking to who and who has the information and how are they reporting it. And so one of the main things that we've been interested in is where are these countries in terms of their access to data to report on SDG 15. And so that's what many of our meetings are about. And so we can assess where each country is in terms of each target and indicator, score them on a 3-tiered system, where essentially tier 1 is access to data and that indicator is being reported on. Then tier 3 is essentially data deficient, and that indicator cannot currently be reported on. And so this is showing this is a slide in Spanish, but just showing some of the heterogeneity in each country's progress towards being able to report on indicators and targets for SDG 15. Excuse me. But one thing that we're also discussing is that there's a set of official indicators, but then there's also a set of national sub-indicators that could complement official global indicators, and that might do a better job of actually capturing the condition of forests as opposed to their extent. And so in red here, what we're showing is some of the additional sub-indicator aspects that we've been discussing with each country, and then black are the official or global indicators. And so in this case, we have forest area as a proportion of total land area, but then we add information on natural forest and ecosystem type to that as kind of a more nuanced assessment of ecosystems and forests in the countries. So for indicator 15.1.2, which is focused on protected areas and coverage of terrestrial and freshwater biodiversity, we add information on proportion of ecosystem types covered by protected areas, proportion of high structural integrity forest, which we can measure now with spaceborne LiDAR and other estimates of canopy height and canopy disturbance. And we have information on human pressures that we can add as well to look at human footprint change in and around protected areas. And then indicator 15.2.1, progress towards sustainable forest management. We have the distribution of forests of high structural integrity by ecosystem type, but then also information on fragmentation and connectivity by forest, and then also as well by high structural integrity forest. And high structural integrity forest is forest that's generally tall, hasn't been disturbed in some time, and has high cover. And so we can get that from a combination of individual data sets. And then finally, we have a red list index, which uses some of those data sets, the forest data sets, as inputs to model the area of suitable habitat for species of high interest to countries to complement the red list index. And so what this is showing is one of the national international indicators of fragmentation that we've developed at the global scale, which uses morphological spatial pattern analysis. And so red shows areas of high fragmentation, white shows areas of low fragmentation. And this is fragmentation of high integrity forests. So we're able to essentially map this consistently across the tropics at this point. And this is an example of the types of information that countries are requesting in order to evaluate these metrics and sub-indicators. And so we actually have the metric formula, the periodicity of the data, the provenance of the data, the scientific publications that support it, the software that can be used to run the algorithm, spatial resolution, where it can be found, interpretations, limitations, and other aspects that essentially go to how it can be reported and whether it can be repeated at the temporal resolution that countries need, which is every 1 to 5 years, I believe. And so that's a bit of what we've been doing in Peru, Colombia, and Ecuador in the context of integrating some of these extent and integrity indicators for reporting. And I just wanted to recognize that most of this couldn't be done without our UNDP, United Nations Development Program regional and national coordinators, as well as PhD students from each country who've been supporting the project and interactions with countries. And so, with that, I'll finish up and hand it back over to Kieran.
Great, thanks so much, Patrick. It's really interesting to see sort of how some of this sort of global data plays out at the national level and how it all sort of has to work together, and then some of the processes that have to be in place to sort of help support that. Our next panelist today is going to be Alessandra Alfieri. She's from the United Nations Statistics Division, where she's the chief of the Environmental Economic Account section and leads the Global Development and Implementation Program on the Sustainable System of Environmental Economic Accounting, or the SEA that Emily mentioned briefly before. Alessandra is going to be giving us a bit of an overview on the SEA system of economic accounts. So over to you, Alessandra.
Thank you very much, Kieran, and thank you very much to the Geo Bond colleagues. I'll make a presentation on the SEA and in particular on the ecosystem extent and condition accounts. I mean, and I think one thing I would like to acknowledge is that we are kind of new, the statistical community is new in this area, and they are kind of building on the expertise of a lot of the people that that have presented before. And basically trying to organize this information and using an accounting approach to the work that has been done in this context. So I'll just briefly say a few words on the FD. Yes.
We are seeing your notes of the. Can you put it in the big full screen mode, please? The presentation.
I thought I changed.
Great, thank you.
Oh, that's okay. Sorry. So I'm going to just briefly talk about the relevance of the SEA, in particular for Goal A of the Global Biodiversity Framework, which deals with ecosystem extent and condition and integrity, and talk a little bit and give a couple of examples on how this has been applied in the context of projects, EU-funded project on implementing the SEA. So just briefly as a background, the SEA was adopted as a statistical standard by the Statistical Commission. See, this is a kind of a big deal, because basically it puts the SEA ecosystem accounts at the same level as the system of national accounts, which measure economic indicators. So the idea is really making now nature part of the official statistical systems. So the next steps now is really move towards implementation. We already have 89 countries that are implementing the SCEA and the central framework, and 34 countries that are implementing the ecosystem accounts, but the idea is really giving it a push. And last week, the Secretary General actually issued this the common agenda, which is basically the plan for the United Nations in the next 5 years, and it clearly stated actually it urged countries, and I quote here, I urge countries to implement the SCEA ecosystem accounts. So it is definitely a major achievement for the statistical community and for the, I think, the broader community to really have the ecosystem part of the official statistical system. So SABSTA also, as part of the CBD process, recognized in its recent meeting that the value of aligning the monitoring framework with the SCEA and to mainstream biodiversity in national statistical system. And this is also a new approach because of before, I would say, the national statistical offices have been out of the, they've not been really sitting at the table in discussing the monitoring systems of the convention. And I think it's is really important now that the national statistical system can contribute and participate in developing and implementing the monitoring framework of the CBD. I mean, as far as goal A is concerned, which deals with extent and condition, we are basically suggesting that the indicators are derived from the system, from the SCEA, and in particular using the IUCN global ecosystem typology that was presented before. So what the ecosystem accounts does is basically we have an ecosystem accounting area which could be at any scales, and for each ecosystem accounting areas we identify different ecosystem types, and then the ecosystem extent is basically consists in summing up, let's say, the areas of the different ecosystem types. And the ecosystem types are classified according to the different ecosystem typologies. So it is very much a spatially explicit approach. And the idea is really to also leapfrog countries with data poor countries using Earth observation data to compile this type of accounts. So what the ecosystem, the SCEA does is basically it looks at an ecosystem which is basically an area and is considered as an asset. For these areas, we measure the extent, we measure the condition in terms of different characteristics, for example, soil depth or vegetation and so on. We measure the ecosystem services that it produced. In this case, it would be water filtration. So the idea, the ecosystem services basically is the contribution of the ecosystem to the benefit, which in this case would be clean water, and also identify the beneficiaries who is actually benefiting from these services, which in this case would be households. So the sequence of accounts, what we measure, as I mentioned before, is the extent, the condition, and the ecosystem services. And then from the ecosystem services in physical terms, the blue box represents really the physical accounts. We estimate the value of these ecosystem services in a consistent way with the system of national accounts, so that we can actually extend the production boundary to look at the contribution of the ecosystems. And then look at basically future flows of these ecosystem services to estimate the monetary value of an ecosystem asset. So in terms of data, we start from the data which is available, and we organize it using a measurement framework and the accounting rules to then derive a set of indicators. So this was already mentioned before. We basically endorsed we chose the IUCN Global Ecosystem Typology Classification as a reference classification. And this as we basically look at the first three levels. The first level is realms, which includes the marine, freshwater, and terrestrial ecosystems, and then the biomes, but we basically look at the accounts to be compiled at the level of the functional group. And here is there are 96 functional groups, and this is kind of a summary of the different functional groups on the right side. One thing that I would like to note here is that each of these functional group identifies, for example, what is called intensive land use system or anthropogenic marine system. So basically what is considered non-natural, so that to make the distinction between what is natural and non-natural ecosystem. In addition to maps, the ecosystem extent can also be represented in forms of tables. And what we look at is we have on the columns the different ecosystem typology. And on the rows, we basically look at the different changes that between opening extent and closing extent, which could be addition or reduction. And we try to distinguish between managed and unmanaged expansion and reduction. This is an example of what was done in the context of India. Basically, the idea is that countries use their national classification, which is much more detailed usually than the EFGs of the IUCN Global Ecosystem Typology, and do some type of a mapping. And here we see that, for example, with the one, there is basically a one-to-one relationship between the national classification and the ecosystem typology. And when we have, for example, something less than one, there is basically one-to-many, so 1 to 2 in this case, of the national classification with the ecosystem typology. And we basically try to do this mapping, and this is quite important for international comparability. But the idea is that countries should be use their national classification and then do the mapping to the IUCN GET, primarily for reporting purposes and countries comparability. Here, this is another example of what was done in the context of Brazil. They tried, again, using their national classification, mostly based on land use and land cover, to map the basically the natural, what is considered natural and what is considered anthropized areas. Again, to make this distinction for reporting eventually to the CBD monitoring framework. And I mean, these are the big biomes used in Brazil. And this is the example of the ecosystem, an ecosystem extent that was derived in the context of Brazil, primarily starting from land cover and land use. So here what this was calculated between the year 2000 and 2018. And especially in 2018, there has been a huge reduction of natural areas. Which amounted, especially in the Amazon and this Cerrado area, amounted to 86.2% of reduction of forest. So also another things that we compile with the accounts is the change matrix, that basically is trying to identify the changes from what to what. So this is a kind of this is the example for the case of Brazil, but just to show that it is quite important to understand if you cut a forest, for example, to what type of ecosystem it's changing into. Just briefly on the ecosystem condition typology, as part of the ecosystem accounts, we also measure the ecosystem condition, which looks at different characteristics. There are abiotic ecosystem characteristics, biotic, and landscape. And here we go into the detail of physical state, chemical state, compositional, structural, functional state, and then landscape and seascape characteristics. So it's quite a detailed list of indicators that are being compiled. And this is kind of an example of the different lists. And what we do is we look at the different values. characterized and different indicators. And here, I mean, we are trying now to detail what are the type of indicators that that could be compiled, but of course that very much depends on the ecosystem types. So this is just an example of how the countries can organize their indicators on condition. And we look at the opening and closing value. This is in stage 1. This is kind of a simple way of looking at different indicators list. When we move to stage 2, we also look at the reference value and the distance to the reference values. And we have an upper and a lower reference value, with upper meaning that is closer, that is basically a good condition, and lower where it's close to collapse. And I mean, and this basically amount basically to rescaling the indicator to basically reflect the naturalness versus the non-naturalness of the indicator. And then we look at the opening and closing value, looking at the distance from the reference value and the change in the indicator. So here, this is an example of an ecosystem condition indicator used in the context of South Africa, where they looked at different national estuarine ecosystems, and they measured, I mean, first the areas, and then they looked at basically the reference condition, which was the 1750 before the English, the British came. And they considered that 1750 was a condition of 100, and then in 2018, basically this was the distance from the reference condition in 1750. And then they, to get an overall index of condition, they added across the different estuarine, basically giving the equal weights. And this is what they came up. In the case of Mexico, we used this ecosystem integrity index, which is kind of a complex, a much more complex way of integrating the various indicators using a Bayesian approach. And here, I mean, this is basically 2018, and it shows that the areas that are basically are not green are the ones where the condition is is poor, and the red ones are primarily linked to where cities are, and where the condition is really poor. And here, I mean, this was calculated for the year 2004 and 2018, and for the different ecosystem types. One important thing is this is still very much experimental. The idea is now what the government of Mexico has decided is to start basically engaging broadly and come up with an agreed method to measure condition based on a set of information which is broadly available, and basically trying to identify which are the indicators that need to be compiled on a regular basis in order to be able to update this agreed ecosystem integrity index for the country. So just a quick word here on basically what are we doing to enable countries to be able to compile this type of indicators. We have launched the areas for SEA, which is basically a technology that allows to compile ecosystem accounts that are consistent with the SEA ecosystem accounting. So it's the extent is not only looking at land cover, but it is at the level of the EFG of the IUCN GET. It also, as part of these areas for SEA, countries are also able to compile land cover accounts using the European Space Agency data sets. And also, so the objective here is really to try to help countries, especially data poor countries, to automate the production of maps and tables. We will have another webinar on tools, and I think we'll go a little bit further in details, but there is also some information which is available, and I can put it in the chat. So basically, the conclusion here is that the statistical community is being involved in this process, and the SEA has been adopted. Standardization is important. I think that there are a number of initiatives here on which we can actually all work together towards the compilation of these accounts and for deriving indicators that are coherent and consistent across countries and over time. So guidelines and tools, and in particular, developing these global data sets that can support countries, it's very important. Thank you.
Great, thank you so much, Alessandra. It's really interesting to start wrapping our heads around how some of these global sources of information can sort of feed and help drive national reporting, and to see a bit about what you mentioned about how some of these issues related to extent and integrity of ecosystems can also help inform discussions around ecosystem services, and that kind of opens up a whole other realm of discussion. So thanks a lot of food for thought. So we have one final speaker. Before turning over to Simon, I just wanted to mention, if you do have any questions, feel free to enter them in the chat, and we'll try and answer as many as we can. So our next speaker today is Simon Ferrier. He's a chief scientist with CSIRO, so that's the Australia's National Science Agency. Simon works on developing and applying quantitative approaches to biodiversity assessment and decision support across local, national, and global scales. He's also chaired the IPBES methodological assessment of scenarios and models. So, IPBES is a really important actor in the convention. And he's served as a contributing author on the IPBES global assessment as well. He's also a founding member of GEO Bond, so it's good to sort of have that perspective as well. And today he's going to be speaking about adding value to the monitoring of ecosystem extent and integrity through sort of different derivatives of habitat-based biodiversity indicators. So with that, over to you, Simon. Thanks.
Great, thanks very much, Kieran. We've heard some excellent presentations on monitoring ecosystem extent and integrity. What I want to talk about now is adding further value to these efforts by making use of these data as inputs to deriving what I will call here habitat-based biodiversity indicators. And what I mean by habitat-based biodiversity indicators, these assess changes or how changes in ecosystem extent and integrity are expected to affect the retention of species diversity. And by doing this, they offer one simple means of actually linking ecosystem and species components of Goal A in the draft Global Biodiversity Framework. These habitat-based indicators can employ mapping either of individual species distributions or overall variation in community composition. In one of the earlier webinars, you heard about the Species Habitat Index, which Walter Jantz talked about. That's an example of a species level approach. Today, I'm going to be giving another example at the community level, and it's focusing on an indicator generated by CSIRO, the Biodiversity Habitat Index. So what the Biodiversity Habitat Index does essentially is it translates ecosystem extent and integrity mapping into an indicator of biodiversity retention or persistence. But this is actually quite a challenging task. When you look at most of the ecosystem integrity products that were talked about earlier, they're normally measuring the integrity at a local level. So the ecosystem integrity per grid cell within a region. And to then say something about what change in that local integrity means in terms of biodiversity persistence across a whole region that involves more than just simply adding up or averaging those local integrity scores across that region. And there are the two main reasons for this are that the level of persistence of species diversity across that larger area will also be a function of not just the average integrity at a local level, but also of the spatial configuration of that habitat across the region, particularly in relation to compositional variation within broad ecosystem types, but also in relation to levels of habitat connectivity. And so the Biodiversity Habitat Index really deals rigorously with both of those factors. This Biodiversity Habitat Index, or BHI, has been generated globally at 1 kilometre grid resolution across all terrestrial biomes. Results can be mapped either at that raw grid cell resolution, or they can be reported across any specified set of spatial units. So when reporting by spatial units, it's really important to emphasize that both of those factors that I mentioned on the previous slide, dealing with compositional variation, dealing with habitat connectivity, both of those get factored in to these calculations up to the regional level. And so this overall capability has already been used quite extensively in assessing global and regional trends in the state of habitat, supporting biodiversity globally. And the analytical foundation has also been used to help prioritise areas for habitat protection or restoration to enhance prospects for biodiversity persistence. The main source of data that we use for the global manifestation of this indicator, the main source of data we use for local ecosystem integrity is in fact the Biodiversity Intactness Index. And this is derived by coupling the Natural History Museum's predicts projects meta-analysis of land use impacts on local biodiversity, coupling that with a downscale land use time series that we in CSIRO have been working on for a number of years now. And just recently, CSIRO and the Natural History Museum have collaborated on updating this time series to provide 1 kilometre resolution mapping of change for every year from 2000 to 2020 globally. And so that covers the entire land surface of the planet. And the Natural History Museum have also committed now to continuing production of that Biodiversity Intactness Index post-2020. But it's important to emphasise that the Biodiversity Habitat Index, the BHI, can be derived, in fact, from any ecosystem integrity input. And a really good example of this is work that's just being completed at the moment, a collaboration between CSIRO, WCS and the University of Queensland is deriving the Biodiversity Habitat Index from the Forest Landscape Integrity Index that got published just last year. And the BHI is also derivable at national and subnational scales, including from UN ecosystem extent and condition accounts data. And just a couple of examples there of where that's already been done. One in the San Martin region of Peru a few years back, and another one much more recently in the Murray-Darling Basin of Australia. So just to conclude, I just wanted to reflect on what habitat-based biodiversity indicators, such as the Biodiversity Habitat Index, can contribute to post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework implementation. And to me, it's all about supporting better integration within that framework. And I've got three main types of integration there: better linking, monitoring of progress towards achieving Goal A with the prioritization of actions under targets 1 to 3, in better integrating consideration of multiple ecosystem-focused components, that is extent, integrity, and connectivity, and the species-focused components of Goal A, and finally, better enabling seamless indicator derivation across spatial scales, employing best available global, national, and subnational data sets. Thank you very much. Back to you, Kieran.
Great, thank you really very much, Simon. That was I think it was a nice way to end the presentations today. Sort of, looking at how we can, take this data that's being collected globally, but also then, sort of make it more applicable, or not make it more applicable, but break it down to be able to tell lots of different stories with the same types of information. So thank you very, very much. So that's it for the presentations today. We're running a bit tight on time, but maybe I'll take the liberty and just sort of throw one question out there, and it's probably a bit of a big one, but I'd be really curious to hear all our panelists' thoughts. And so anyway, throughout the negotiation process on the post-2020 framework and the discussions on indicators and monitoring, one of the concerns that's been expressed by quite a number of countries is, what is the reporting burden that's going to be placed on countries from having to report on various indicators related to these goals and targets. So I'm wondering if some of the panelists would want to actually talk a bit about that and sort of explain or provide their views from their perspectives on actually how big of a task is it to take this global data and internalize it or break it down to national level and actually to report on it. What if for a country that's starting perhaps with not so much experience in using this type of information, what is actually, how daunting of a task is this to actually take these big global data products and apply them nationally? So I don't know, perhaps just to start it off, perhaps either Victor, Gary, or Patrick would like to jump in on that, just because they spoke a fair bit about sort of using this global data at a national level. But I mean, it's an open question to everyone. So I guess just to rephrase the question, how intensive is this type of process in terms of taking this global information and breaking it down and making it nationally relevant for a country, and that can be in terms of financial resources, but it's also in terms of staff time and capacity and training. Thanks very much.
Well, maybe I'll jump here. Well, I'm very fortunate to work in the country of Colombia, which has made great progress on developing national products. We are very active, and I guess it's a challenge and an opportunity at the same time. I mean, one of the biggest challenges, I will say, and it's something that we are experiencing beyond the challenge of processing such large data sets, it's how do we ensure that we can report on how reliable can be those products? And that requires a lot of capacity. So I see a great opportunity of bringing together all these data sets, especially for countries that haven't had the opportunity to develop capacity themselves. Obviously, there are some conflicts in the data products that need to be resolved, but I think the main capacity to integrate these data products is how to ensure that this is a continuous process where quality is permanently checked and improved as new data sources come out, or the country develops a new ability to process them. And we are still in working on that, but I believe that that's the most important element to consider. How can you tell the users how much they can rely on the products, and where are the main gaps that need to be filled or improvements so that the countries can continuously improve their capacity to monitor ecosystem change?
Thanks. I think that's really interesting, and it actually it mirrors a point that we've heard a lot also in the negotiations, that there's oftentimes a bit of a reluctance, shall we say, to use global data products, just because countries may not necessarily fully understand where this information is coming from, what the gaps and limitations are around it. So understandably, there's some challenges in sort of using that in any sort of official national reporting if those processes aren't clear. So I'm not sure if anybody any other panels wants to jump in on that point.
I just wanted to say real quick that I appreciate the question, and that's definitely an issue that's come up in our discussions with agencies and staff at agencies, is that staff time is really precious and often in short supply. So the kind of the more work that we can do as data providers and algorithm developers to essentially ease or to cooperate with staff to talk about those issues of uncertainty, data quality, and integrity of the data. Anything along those lines can really help countries with adoption of Earth observations for their reporting needs.
Great, thanks. And I see Alessandra has her hand up. So over to you, Alessandra.
Yeah, no, just to say that, I mean, it is very important that there is ownership at the country level. So I think the way we are going to use this global data product is to develop, let's say, some kind of initial estimates, but then work with the countries to get the buy-in. And it is an opportunity because, I mean, it's not only one agency which is responsible for these data sets, but we need basically bringing all the agencies together in an interinstitutional mechanism. It is a challenge, but it is also a very big opportunity also to mainstream it eventually into policy. It's not only developing the data, but how this data can be used, and the process of obtaining the buy-in, it's quite important.
Great. Yeah, thank you very much. I think that's really helpful, this point about, yeah, I mean, how do we build these bridges between these different communities on the one hand, the data providers and the people that are actually, collecting and pulling together all this wonderful information, but how do we then present that, to decision makers and people who ultimately need to use that information, and how can we make the most of these efforts? I think that's a really big question. It's probably not something we'll resolve in the next 2 minutes, but I think it's a really important thing for all of us to keep in mind as we're continuing on this path, right? Is how do we make sure that we're getting the most bang for our buck, so to speak, in all these wonderful and really fascinating ways of collecting and monitoring what's happening around the world. Anyway, it's pretty, when I think about all the incredible advances that have happened just in the last 10 years in this field, it's really pretty remarkable, and it gives me a lot of hope for I think the framework. So unless anybody else wants to jump in on this, I think maybe we'll end there, just because I'm cognizant of time, and I know that a number of our panelists have been really kind enough to wake up at very inconvenient hours to be with us today, and I don't want to infringe on their generosity any more than we already have. So I think we'll stop there. I really want to thank all the panelists again for sharing your experience. It's been really, as I said, really helpful, and I think it's given a lot of people sort of more points to reflect on as we continue this journey towards developing a post-2020 framework and everything else that goes with that. I'd also just really like to thank Geo Bond for organizing the session today. It's been really helpful, and all the partners that have been involved in the other presentations as well. So with that, I think we'll bring things to an end, and I'll just end by saying thank you very much.